Welcome, everyone, to the very first Book at Lunchtime of 2025. Those of you who are new to Book at Lunchtime, I can see some grizzled veterans who've made that trip up the stairs many, many times. So thank you ever so much for doing that today. We have been running Torch Book at Lunchtime since 2013. So starting the year with such a wonderful and captivating book is a particular pleasure and privilege. And today we welcome Thea Gomelauri, and we will be discussing the Lailashi Codex. Now, when I mentioned to my daughters that we were doing a book called the Lailashi Codex, they said, wow, an amazing spy thriller. That sounds absolutely amazing. When is the film coming out? So I thought I might welcome our expert panel, and I will be handing over to Thea shortly. But I thought I would read this because this captivated me. This book presents for the first time the fascinating history and content of the Lailashi Codex, tracing its turbulent journey, replete with mysteries, imprisonments, executions, inaccurate references, conflicting records, unsubstantiated claims, possessions and repossessions, controversies, miracles, and ending with a most surprising discovery and the hope of addressing issues related to the cultural memory of an exquisite artefact. And of course, in my reading, I would also add in, not forgetting the KGB, MI6, keepers, criminals, and extremely exotic locations, which we'll be finding out more about. So it's wonderful to have you all here. Welcome to 2025 and Book at Lunchtime. And I now hand over to our particularly expert panel to enlighten us all. Thea.
Thank you very much, John. I am delighted to present a new material I came across after the publication of the book. So I'm greatly honored to have with me first Professor Sebastian Brock, who is an expert in early Christianity studies and who had the privilege also being in Georgia before Lailashi Codex was discovered. He has a very good knowledge of the context of Georgia and Christianity and religion, and he will share his fascinating comments, references about it. And also, it's my great honor to present Professor Thea Gomelauri, Professor of Armenian Studies, the closest we could get to Georgian Studies in Oxford, which doesn't have professorship in Georgian Studies. I decided to focus on shared material culture, and that's why it is most appropriate to look at this issue from a regional perspective. People ask me how long you've been working on this issue, and I say, since I have known it, but it has not been long because despite its long history, it was not well known even those who were in Georgia. You have to consider Soviet time when everything related with religion was forbidden and tabooed, and those artifacts were completely unattended. And it's only in the last decade or so that we really started to look into the materials and in the context, and that's how Lailashi Codex emerged. For those of you who have read the book, I have a few exciting news to add to this publication. I discovered some documentary evidence which takes us back to 100 years, involves the King of Georgia and the judicial royal decree, which mentions the Codex as a sacred object upon which the oath have to take. I'll give you a little overview, pictorial overview, before I hand over to our panelists. Let me just, this is one of the famous Caucasian peak, and how close Lailashi is to this highest peak in Caucasia. Modern photo, aerial view, Lailashi village and the area on the back, you see Caucasian mountains. And this is the first photo, the inhabitants of the village, the horse carriage and houses. That's what it was, Lailashi in 1912, yes, welcoming Poetagakis Ereteli. Look, almost a surreal place. This is the facade of Armenian church, Georgian Orthodox Church, St. George Church, the oldest remaining part. The other parts were destroyed. And this is the synagogue, Lailashi Codex last home before it was confiscated and taken to Tbilisi. So it's lived here. And these are some amazing images that you can see, micrography in itself. This is entire pictorial timeline of Lailashi Codex. However, those new documents that precede this 1869 are not included yet. Since the publication of the book, I discovered new evidence by Georgian priest and main archivarius. This gentleman right here, this number 4 photo, you see this is George Borjoridze, an unsung hero who saved lots of material cultures, went parallel, pursuing them and salvaging the final remaining artifacts before Soviets took them. And he was arrested, sentenced to exile. And when he was transported to Gulag, he vanished. His body was never found. The story is that he was killed on the train and he was thrown from the train. Therefore, as you can imagine, all his papers and all his writings, everything was confiscated. What condemned him? He published one of his findings in England, Caucasian Studies journal called Georgica, and in Georgica, 1936, he published an article about one particular Georgian cross and its description, and next year he was arrested. So his biographer believes that that could have been a reason that publishing and having academic contacts with enemies of Soviet could have been the reason that ended his life at the age of 53. He traveled on foot almost in every village in Georgia and collected over 2,000 artifacts, described and made notes on every inscription in the churches. He obviously was interested and described only Georgian artifacts. But luckily, he also mentions important items that he encounters. So after his death, all his archive and all his belongings were scattered. And a few years ago, they accidentally discovered in the archive. It was mixed with other papers, completely unrelated description of particular region, Raja. He himself was from Raja, which is the region where the Lailashi comes. And he's been there no less than 3 times to describe everything. And here comes the Lailashi Codex beside this. He confirmed something I always believed but didn't have evidence. One of the most tantalizing and unanswered questions about Lailashi Codex is its provenance. We can describe history, but the provenance is completely shrouded in mystery. Until now, the old theories, it was brought either from Spain and Sephardic countries or from East. I always thought that there could have been other versions. In order to prove it, we needed more than one evidence and more than one book. It was not impossible that Lailashi emerged in Georgia. Within Jewish community that resided in Georgia in medieval times. this theory and this direction was never taken seriously. But now, because of George Bojoriz's historical evidence, we know, he says, upon visiting Lailashi, he says he found not one, but two Hebrew Bible codices, both written on parchment, which obviously relates to the age. And he goes even further than Chorny does, describing is the most lavishly decorated case where it was kept, those parchments, those sheets were kept. And he describes in wonderful detail, saying that the case was decorated with ivory and with precious stones. So we have much more evidence now to believe, and not one and two. So it is very unlikely that two identical Hebrew Bibles could have been simply brought to this village. Most likely version, which I'm working, is that most probably one was already getting out of use and the copy could have been made. And there is much more than we discovered so far. So I won't be able to run through all this, but these dates and a few snapshots gives you an idea of how this story runs, and we can discuss in more details. But perhaps I will ask now Professor Sebastian Bruck to step in and say a few or so words, and then we can continue. Yes.
So, as Thea pointed out at the beginning, I work in a different field, but I do work on manuscripts, Syriac manuscripts. So histories of manuscripts, and it's a wonderful detective story that you've written, absolutely fascinating. And as has happened with the Lailashi Codex, manuscripts get broken up in the course of time. And one of the exciting things in the book is the discovery of 3 extra folios in the Israel National Library. So even in a very central place in the sort of area of scholarship, you can make great discoveries. And this has been my experience also with Syriac, where quite often you find an initial discovery, such as there's sort of reviving of interest in the Lailashi Codex, then that leads to further discoveries. And there have been some quite remarkable ones in the case of Syriac. There's a very famous monastery on Sinai, St. Catherine's Monastery. And a few years ago, a French colleague of mine wrote a marvelous book where he collected together all the scattered leaves from manuscripts in Sinai. A huge task. Of course, this is only on printed paper. One day it would be good to have them virtually recomposed, as it were, photographic, digital photography, but that's obviously a very expensive thing to do. But I imagine in this case it's much cheaper and more practical thing to do. So the fact that these manuscripts get divided up and sold and resold gives one hope that maybe the lost folios might one day turn up. Because I think you mentioned that the rabbi of Lailashi had in his own possession a number of folios, so the breakup of the manuscript goes back quite a long time. And sometimes odd folios are given as presents and things like that. So people should keep their eyes open in sales of private collections, and who knows what might turn up. And this has been the case with several quite famous Syriac texts, that they've turned up, I suppose you'd say, on the black market. And then a few years later, some more of the same manuscript turns up. So it's been held back by the the owners who want a bigger price. So that's one of the exciting aspects of this manuscript, that there's always hope that more will turn up. The aspect that I'm intrigued by is the micrography, this incredibly fine writing. In Syriac manuscripts, you do have examples of micrography, but on a minute scale compared with what we have here. And it's usually incorporated into geometrical designs, decoration. And if you're lucky, you can find the name of the scribe hidden away somewhere. I don't think that ever happens with Hebrew manuscripts, but I may be totally wrong. But it would be quite a task to read all this micrography. But most of it is known text. But who knows? The scribe's name might be hidden somewhere. But that's someone with a lot of patience, a lot of time to go through all the material. In Syriac, we do have things called Masoretic manuscripts from much the same period and doing much the same sort of thing. They're actually not called Masoretic in the Syriac tradition. They're just called terms or words, shmohe. And they give information, the same sort of thing, about how many letters there are and very detailed things, not by any means to the extent that you find in some of the Hebrew Masoretic treatises. I was fascinated by the example given in your book of words which are paired from different parts of the Hebrew Bible. We don't have anything like that, but we do have the middle verse or the middle word and that sort of thing, how many words there are. So it's a much more smaller scale, but it is remarkable that these two phenomena of sort of exegetical tradition turn up just about the same time. The Syriac manuscripts are almost exactly the same period as these fantastic manuscripts, but on, as I say, on a much smaller scale. So that's really the two things that struck me most. The nature of the micrography. I've sometimes experimented with copying texts in the way that ancient scribes would. And I know how difficult it is to design a single line so that you get justification on the left as well as on the right. In fact, I see this scribe does not aim at justification, but in other manuscripts you will find the left side of the main text is justified. It's incredibly difficult to do this well. You have to think ahead as well as pay attention to what you're copying. And there's so many dimensions of what you need to pay attention to that you can easily go wrong. And that, if in a Hebrew manuscript, is a disaster. It's bad enough in a Syriac one. But when you're looking at the micrography, just designing how to write that, and how on earth did they do it? They must have had, as it were, models from which to work, rather like embroidery or something. So you've got a pattern, but then to fit the letters in so that they do make some sort of, well, that they do fit. But I was interested to see that not all the texts that are copied actually are complete texts. So you can give up in the middle if you haven't got space, and no one will notice, or most people will not notice. So that, I think, is what I would like to say, so hand over to Theo.
I come from Armenian studies, as was mentioned, the adjacent area to Georgia. For those who have read the book, Armenians, as they do more often, tend to pop up every now and then. They do in this book as well. There is in Lailashi an obelisk which commemorates, this is from the post-Soviet period, 2003 if I'm not mistaken, the peaceful living together, which always makes me anxious when I hear that people have been living peacefully together for centuries, as is mentioned there. Greeks, Georgians, Jews and Armenians. And this is in a village which, if I'm not mistaken, is now 99% Georgian inhabited. Yeah. So what we have in the Lailashi Codex is an absolutely thunderous witness of a big change. We have the material remnants of the synagogue of the Armenian church, from the image I saw a rather reduced Georgian Orthodox Church in this case. And it made me wonder about the history of the people who had come at some point and who had gone. I read somewhere that perhaps Armenians and Jews together might have come in the 16th century from Achaltsikhe in Javakheti to Lailashi, fleeing before Ottoman troops. And but in Armenian studies, this is not a well-known chapter. I can tell you. So I wondered what more there might be known about it. But before that, I wondered how the Jewish community came to be reduced. What happened to it? Was this a result of eventually the latest 1951 purges that Stalin undertook on an anti-Semitic basis, or were there other reasons? Was there a big repatriation to Israel, and how did that go? And do we have any memory among people who lived in Lailashi, other than the rabbis, who knew about the Codex, and do they have a relationship to it? Is there any sense of pride or of loss of not being in the presence of such an impressive book? That's one of my questions. I have others as well.
I want to make one comment about the layout. One issue, which is the crown of the Lailashi scribe, is the scribes mark the midpoint of the book. In order to plan the layout, you have to know when you arrive at the midpoint. What we have in the case of Lailashi, and I have a special map to show, not here, Lailashi scribe calculates not every word, but every letter and empty space between the letters, so much so that he arrives at the middle verse of the Pentateuch, makes it middle page, the beginning line. It's amazing to see how he fluctuates. Sometimes you have over 900 characters on the page, and sometimes 600. But when you look through the codex, you don't see. So he fluctuates the space between us. So this is something most remarkable. When we speak about the middle of the Pentateuch, it is a middle of the book, the remarkable achievement. Many other things which I won't go, but this is one point. And about the Theo's question, Professor Van Lint, I want to say a few things about Armenian importance that pops. In the newly discovered this royal charter of king, there is a dispute about ownership of the Jewish serfs. The dispute is about paying taxes. Those five brothers, Jewish five brothers, they say that we are church serfs and we pay our duties to the Catholicos, who at the time was brother of the king. A local landowner claims that you are my serfs and you have to pay. So this is the dispute. King himself interferes and orders the community there to make the public code and specifically mentioned you, Georgians, Jews, and Armenians, come together and give me the witness statement. The judgment would not have been complete without Armenian witness statement. So this is fascinating evidence of full participation. We don't have time now to go into the details, but this is next edition of this fascinating story. Also, Lailashi, and speaking of Armenian studies, one of the things which is most important, it has never been looked whether Lailashi Codex appears in other writings, Armenians, as you mentioned, like we discovered this Georgi Bojoridze, the Orthodox priest who described Georgian churches, and he suddenly mentions that, oh, by the way, Lailashi, I found 2 Hebrew Bibles. So it has never been studied or looked whether in Armenian sources, the visitors and many other writers mentioned what they've seen, what they encounter. So concerning repatriation, yes and no, in a sense that I don't have here to display the photos, but Lailashi once very prominent, the trade center gradually became so impoverished. There was no exile or any conflict or anything. That's why it has become unpopulated. So it was just local conditions that leading to this. First time in the history of Jewish-Georgian relationship, Lailashi Codex was brought in dialogue with Shota Rustaveli. And if you know anything about Georgia, you know that Shota Rustaveli is uncrowned king of Georgian literature. And most importantly, they have this personal encounter in the book. Lailashi Codex on the background is used to save the only known depiction of Rustaveli we have. So it's great contribution to saving this material culture. So again, speaking of shared material culture, there is no better example than the Lailashi Codex to facilitate sort of this interaction. I'm also greatly honored to have with us Professor Anna Abulafia, who is expert on Jews having come from the Menshevik family. So this is Soviet time. And yes, I would very much welcome contribution. Thank you very much, Anna. Just before I answer this particular question, I want to make one point. We didn't have time to discuss it. Lailashi Codex is the not only crown of manuscripts in Jewish Georgian community. There is much better known Bible, which we didn't have time to mention here, but I'm writing in the next one, and it is known as a Bread Bible. Bread Bible, and not one but 2, was much more revered, and you have to look in that context that you, by looking at Georgian Jewish scholarship, which always built on the margin and not being considered in that sense of producing any written material, now we have evidence not in one place but in several places. So they emerge. However, we have similarities and differences. Let me tell you first. Speaking of Bread Bible, it's always been in a private possession. And there was always exchange between a local Georgian landowner, yes, which, and the Jewish community trade off there. But speaking of Lailashi Codex, what is most interesting and the things that lead me to a certain conclusion, it's never has been in any private possession. We don't have any individual who owned it. Since production, it was always belonged to the local community. Now, speaking of the content, this second evidence which emerged now does not names what was inside, but I have another evidence that fits within, and this comes from Georgian Jewish Museum, which was established and then abolished during Soviet, which existed only a few years in order to confiscate Lailashi and other together, and then they closed. And in their records, we have fascinating reference that has never been followed. One of these museum researcher writes that we have information. There is identical sister copy of Lailashi Codex. And he writes about it sort of passingly. We do not know this Georgian, the evidence that comes does not say, it doesn't appear his study, what he said, he must have seen and describes outwardly. But collated with the other evidence, when a Jewish researcher says that it's identical copy, it leads to the conclusion that identical copy must have been only copied from one to another, which again points out to the local. Speaking of money, studying the manuscript, there are few points that strike you and lead you to a certain conclusion, and that's what leads me to the local, towards local provenance. When you study manuscript, one thing that strikes is that this is expert scribe who knows his job inside out and can pinpoint the word in the book and then distribute here and there equally the whole text. But material that he is working, parchment, is lamentable. So poor. It doesn't look like it was commissioned for money. It strikes me as a labor of love. And there are many other points. And there's so many, I would say perhaps clues, or sometimes that you could be, and one of the issues most striking and confusing is this very peculiar decoration. Bible was not divided in chapters, it was divided by sections, which are known as parashiot sections. And each section has the same sign, which the certain three-letter combination, peresh and shin, to indicate that the new section begins. And this, in three cases, is written in such a unique way that such a great expert as well himself, who annotated the Leningrad Codex, he reads as a combination of two letters, but I see there are three letters as I have described. Now, what is the significance of this point? If you know anything about Georgian script and Georgia, you know, similar to Arabic influence we have here, it was particularly nice decoration to write letters with one hand without breaking them. The more letters you connect, it's better. So I think this, in this case, it strikes me as him making this ligature, following the local Georgian style, writing all three in a way that when you look, what is this, you ask? As indicated in the title, it's the codex, which means the book format. It's not a scroll 188 leaves. In Georgia, we have 169. And the 3 leaves were identified in National Library of Israel, which is continuation of the Song Hazinu, which is end of Deuteronomy, as you know, Song of Moses, 2 pages. Still, we have lacking pages at the end. And one right here, the one, it's, the end of Genesis. So we are still missing 16 pages. Out of these 16, 4 pages are not non-biblical text. So 4 pages must have been what we call Masoretic notes. So speaking from biblical text, it's 12 pages that are missing, and selectively, only complete book is Book of Numbers. When you look at the codex, you can almost see why certain pages are missing, and I'll tell you. There are special sections that would have been particularly lavishly decorated, and you won't be surprised to hear that would have been what? 10 Commandments pages. Actually, this is the only case in the codex when you have 2 pages missing, double. So otherwise, you have selectively missing here 1 and 2. So it's only 2 pages next to each other. It's missing, and I'm very much convinced that they are not lost. They are kept in private hands, most probably, and who knows, one day they may come in light into libraries and so. When it was written, Tsereteli, who first studied, they did in the 10th century, but Wales put it a little bit later. It has never been scientifically dated. This is not allowed, so we can only estimate. So I place it in the middle 11 or towards the end of 11th century. So this is most probable estimation.
Thank you to our expert panel for a fascinating session and some wonderful questions too. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, John. Thank you.